a lot of the young architectural practices who are listening in, I think it's very important for us to get out and decentralize. If we can get out of our urban clutches and get into smaller urban settlements, that'll make much more meaningful stuff.
So we started to realize how architecture can be more open for it to become available or for everyone. And I think especially for the people who need, public institutions the most, architecture should not discriminate.
Hi everyone, I'm Priya, your host for this webinar, and I'm delighted to welcome you to episode 12 of We See Live Season 3. Well, if you're joining us for the first time, We See Live is presented by the Godrej Value Co-Creators Club, formerly known as GVCC, an initiative by Godrej Locks and Architectural Solutions. Well, as you all know that GVCC, a vibrant community of over 2,000 architects and designers across India, is brought together not just to share ideas, but to explore innovations and champion meaningful design. So in case you haven't joined yet, just click the link in the chat box and become a part of this growing, vibrant community. Well, before we move forward, let's take a moment to see what GVCC is all about.
Welcome to the Godrej Value Co-Creators Club, where innovation meets collaboration. GVCC is a unique platform for architects and interior designers to merge their creative visions with our innovative product offerings. We aim to cultivate a network of thought leaders, driving innovation and excellence in the industry. Celebrate your achievements with our GV's Awards, recognizing innovative projects across various verticals. Join our community through exhibition visits and masterclasses to stay updated on the latest trends and technologies. Enjoy exclusive access to new products, special discounts, and tours of our Mumbai and Goa plants. Join the Godrej Value Co-Creators Club today. Be part of a community that values innovation, collaboration, and sustainability.
Well, that looks fantastic. While Godrej Locks and Architectural Solutions, a leading and trusted home safety business, has announced the launch of its latest brand campaign, Befikar Living Unlocked, introducing us to the next-gen advanced IoT 9 digital lock. Well, the campaign here highlights Godrej's commitment to enhancing home safety through innovation with a new television commercial that creatively addresses everyday safety concerns. So all your eyes at the screen, let us have a look at the video.
Thrusters.
Check. Door lock check.
डोर लॉक घर का डोर लॉक किया था या भूल गया घर का लॉक फटाफट से चेक करके आऊं क्या
ले आइए गोदरेज IoT 9 डिजिटल लॉक 9 सिक्योर एक्सेस मोड्स ऑटोमेटिक लॉकिंग ट्रिपल बोल्ट और कई एडवांस फीचर्स अब घर के अंदर या बाहर रहो बेफिक्र
घर जाते ही गोदरेज डिजिटल लॉक लगवाऊंगा
Well, truly addressing everyday safety concerns. With that, ladies and gentlemen, before we move ahead, let me introduce you all to the theme of We See Live Season 3. Well, We See Live, a monthly thought leadership series that brings together industry pioneers to explore the future of architecture and design. I must say that across seasons, we've explored everything from smart living to material innovation and human-centered design. Well, let us talk about this season's theme, which is Future Forward, that will really explore how innovation, sustainability, and people-first thinking are reshaping the way we live, work, and experience spaces. So today's session is about architecture for impact that will zoom in on how architects are shaping meaningful, socially conscious, and community-driven built environments. Well, we'll also have an engaging Q&A at the end of our presentation, so do not forget to drop your questions in the Q&A tab as we go along. Well, with that, I believe it is befitting for me to now introduce you all and invite our first speaker for this segment. Well, joining us, ladies and gentlemen, is a pioneer of social and civic architecture, designing spaces that connect communities and reimagine cities. Well, his projects like the Pasig River Esplanade, the Bookstop Project, and FEM Stadium are exemplary in creating public realms that encourage interaction, knowledge exchange, and environmental stewardship. Well, his philosophy is about using architecture to positively impact society from urban promenades to modular public pavilions. Well, by now, I'm sure that you all know who I'm talking about. Joining us is William T. Jr. from WTA Architecture and Design Studio, Philippines.
Hi, everyone.
A very warm welcome, William.
Thanks for having us over. Yeah.
Well, we're happy to have you here, and over to you.
Yeah. So I'd like to share with everyone my projects. Yeah. So today I'd like to talk about social architecture. This has been a good part of our social advocacy and our architectural agenda for the last decade or so. So I think for me to be able to tell the story about social architecture, I start with where I grew up. So I grew up in Tondo, which is basically the densest district in the world. I think a bit denser than Mumbai even. So these three places is where I live, our office and my school. So I used to traverse, this very dense district growing up. And so I learned, a lot about being in a city like this. And sometimes it becomes daunting, to be this tiny architect in a big city. So what we like to think of is like we want to think of our city as slices of like small communities. And so being a tiny architect in a smaller community doesn't feel as challenging in many ways. The idea about social architecture came about with this first project called the Bookstop Project. It came about because when as architects, when we're tasked with designing libraries, we always get asked the question of like whether people still read books, do they like going to libraries? And I've always loved the feel of a book in my hands, the suspense as you turn a page, the smell of print. And I felt like maybe it's the platform that needs to change. Because when you're faced with libraries like this, for example, the Rose Reading Room in the New York Public Library, there's this sense where, you have to keep quiet, you can't horse around, you can't enjoy yourself and be with your friends. So we thought to ourselves, what if we, activated our parks and piazzas or plazas and simply built a library in the park? And so we built ourselves this project called the Bookstop Project. And what we did was we made it so open that people felt comfortable coming to the library. And we realized that when architecture is very free, and inclusive, then children become comfortable. They actually start staying in the library. They start hanging out in the library. And in many ways, now you've activated the park and you've kind of like created a campfire where people gather, and share stories. And we feel like this is what libraries really are about anyway. It's a platform for us to share our stories, as individuals. But one of the more interesting byproducts of this project was we started to see all the street kids start hanging out by the libraries or by the bookstop. And we realized that maybe, it's not that the street kids want to be on the streets, but they don't have enough places that actually welcome them. They don't have maybe enough libraries that are open to them where you don't have to have the proper clothes or the proper shoes. So we started to realize how architecture can be more open for it to become available or for everyone. And I think, especially for the people who need, public institutions the most, architecture should not discriminate. And so this kind of like started this program that we've been doing in our studio. So we've built the Book Nook in two shopping malls. We've built the second bookstop, the third one, and now we have the fifth one up already here inside another park. And we're in the process of building a sixth and seventh library. So doing this, this idea that we can actually build a network of libraries instead of like a big, massive library where everyone has to go to. Maybe we can build all these like small pop-up libraries and it can be part of our daily lives. And so it can be kind of like socially more intimate and more inclusive. And so this leads us to kind of like the lessons we learned about the Bookstop project and the characteristics that kind of like define what social architecture is for us. The first idea is this idea about social intimacy, that we want to make places hyper local and convenient. So the Philippines is made up of 42,000 barangays. So the entire country is divided into these small communities, and the barangays are the boats from that we rode when we migrated to the islands. And then the entire country is also made of about 3,000 parishes and much, much more chapels. What this means is that the church and the state have realized that for them to reach out to everyone in the country, they have to go to the people instead of having the people go to them. And so they have to be ubiquitous and everywhere. So we tried this also when we did this exhibition for the Museo del Prado. So we built these modules where we can actually, form galleries and halls, where we can form centerpieces. And we started to think like, okay, it's not just about libraries, but other, public or civic institutions can be made to be more open. So instead of like going to a museum and having a list of artwork that you want to see, you can, pass by the museum every day, look at a piece of art and richer, your day, and make your days just richer that way and enjoy it. So this means that architecture, by being everywhere, can be part of our daily lives. This makes it local, this makes it convenient, and it makes it accessible. The second lesson that we learned from the Bookstop project is this idea about freedom of movement. Many of the buildings, even the parks in the Philippines like this, have been fenced off from the public. And it feels like society itself is trying to, create barriers. The Philippines, everywhere, every commercial establishment will have a security guard. And we actually have a much bigger security guard force than we have armed forces. So the largest armed group in our country are private security guards. And so we started thinking about ourselves, maybe architecture should be more open. Architecture should not discriminate. So when we were tasked with doing, the Ferdinand E. Marcos Stadium, we started to think that there's an inherent problem with stadiums in the Philippines because Filipinos don't play football. So many times, or oftentimes, the stadiums become white elephants. So we thought to ourselves, what can we do with this stadium? And we thought, why not make it an extension of the park in front of it? So here in front of this stadium is the park across. And so we thought to ourselves, why don't we chop off one side of the stadium, make it open so that everyone can just walk in, go up this lawn, um, and make it into a stadium park. So now instead of having, this fence off stadium, that you use when there's events, it becomes part of people's everyday lives. There's no barriers to entry. People just walk in, and it serves as a much needed addition to the park that we had across the street. And so by making it open, it is a very simple stadium. It becomes kind of like a stadium, for the people. And we also removed the road that separates it from the university beside it. We made it part of the campus. And in many ways, I think it showed us how we can actually apply, social architecture in a much bigger context, how we can use it to create urban centralities, and how we can think about architecture that does not discriminate. As architects, we always think about accessibility. We think about accessibility for the physically challenged and handicapped, but we forget that a large part, of our cities is made up of people who maybe don't have access to proper identifications or IDs, proper clothes, proper shoes, who don't have maybe, the money to spend on transportation to get to the major institutions that they need access to. So for architecture not to discriminate, we have to remove these barriers and open it up to them. The third lesson that we learned about social architecture is this idea about a social scale. We architects like to talk about the human scale, but in many ways, I think civic architecture especially needs to serve a higher or a separate purpose, especially when you're building in a very dense or very big city. That each piece of infrastructure has to serve to connect people and become soft infrastructure in return. So when we were tasked with fixing the Pasig River, which is the city that basically bisects the capital of the Philippines, we thought to ourselves, the main thing that we need to do is to activate this, is to create spaces for people to gather, is to allow people to actually bike across the entire city and maybe save, their daily commute. And so we thought, how do we create this project that would cross 110 barangays, that would serve 1.5 million people and go across 6 cities? Sorry. And so there are many challenges that would be faced with this. Largely, there's informal settlements along the river. There's limited pedestrian bridges. Actually, there's not a single pedestrian bridge across the Pasig River. So we started to divide this into segments. And we have now looked at this as 9 segments. And these 9 segments address different needs, of the different cities by the river. But mainly, there's 5 main points that we wanted to kind of like identify with this project. The idea is that we're creating public open space. And this public open space is closer to everyone. You don't have to travel to get to the park, but it will be immediately accessible to 1.5 million people. We're creating commercial development, meaning jobs that are nearby to 1.5 million people. We're creating 2 more modes of transport. The river becomes kind of like a mass transit system, but also we're creating uninterrupted bike lane. And now, maybe a 1 hour travel could become like a 15-minute bike ride. We're creating tourism and more jobs locally. We're restoring the river to what it can be. And we're creating housing for the settlements along the river. So these are the 6 main things that we wanted to correct with this project. And what we've done is we've started with 1 segment, meaning the segment near the downtown core. So we've started to revive the river. People started hanging out here. You see buskers, you see cosplayers, you see performers, you see vendors. And these are all people who would not have somewhere to practice or, to sell before. And what's happened now is we finished about 3 kilometers of it, and we've been able to connect the original city of Manila, meaning Intramuros, with the nearest light rail transit station. And so this is how it looks like right now. The river has attracted many, many people. Usually we get about maybe 10,000 people a day. And I think during the last New Year, we had about 500,000 people along this river watching the fireworks. And so we've managed to kind of like create a new centrality, in Manila, and without sacrificing, much land, without reclaiming anything. We just cleaned up the river and we created this like massive promenade where people can gather, where people can stay. And we've also allowed there now to be much more eyeballs. People are becoming aware about the river. They know that they have to preserve the river, because awareness is actually the first step, towards environmental sustainability. And we feel like by creating, this space that is open, that is public, something that is seldom seen in our city, I think people will become more aware about public space, become aware about, what they have to preserve for the future. And I think it reminded us, like why we build. And I made it a point to bring my daughter when she was like 4 months old, to go see the river and appreciate it, at least while we still have this river. Now, a lot of these civic projects have made us realize that architecture has been a difficult journey, but none more so than this project that we built during the pandemic. This is an emergency quarantine facility. So during the pandemic, we were all, taught that the best way to fight COVID-19 was to separate or create distance between each other. But when we live in a city like this was taken at the height of the pandemic. I think this was April 19, 2020. People simply did not have anywhere to go. People would need to take turns to sleep in a city like this. So we started to think, and realize, what can we build? The government was busy building these like centralized medical facilities. And yet, I think there's a more immediate need that we can address. And so as architects, I started to realize that maybe the role we need to address is this idea that we build for our own communities. So we wanted to build something that is local, something that is near, that is familiar to everyone, and it's accessible and immediate. So we started to augment the local hospitals. We started to utilize the parking lots, the open spaces near the hospitals, and started to immediately build like 16 rooms, 32 rooms, or 32 beds for each hospital. And with this idea of like having just three simple drawings, and sharing it with, the local builders, and sending an architect on site, kind of like revisiting this idea about architects being builders, that we're able to build these structures in about 3 days and 5 days. So the first 3 days, you're basically building up the structure. And the next 2 days, you're plugging in the air conditioning, the water, the utilities. So the main concept is about speed and scalability. And we ended up using steel and wood, plastic and wood, because these two materials are something that you will find in any island in our archipelago. It's something that anyone knows how to work with. It's very forgiving. You make a mistake, you just get another piece of wood or plastic. So it's hand built. You don't need machinery, you don't need equipment. And basically, in 3 days, the community itself can come together to build this. And the architect just needs to be there to kind of like shape it to whatever site or site conditions you have. And so I feel like we kind of like address, this much needed role, that architects can serve in a community. This idea that we are actually organizers, we bring people together, we reach out to medical workers, to frontliners like, like the police, the army, and this idea that we can bring vendors in also, and because everyone was willing to give, it's just a matter of giving them a platform and a way to build. And so we were able to build multiple structures inside our city itself. I think in the end, we built about 75 quarantine facilities in Metro Manila. And outside Manila, we also shared our plans with other architects, other friends across the region, and they were able to build further facilities there, built in their own form and shape. So all in all, we were able to build about 3,500 beds, in the Philippines, and even outside the country in Singapore. We had friends who were adapting this. Um, and as late as 2022, I think like 50% of them were still up and running. And even we had one in exhibit in Denmark, even they built a life-size sample there as well. And then maybe at the end, if there's still time, with a 2-minute video of the latest project we're working on. And just wanted to share this with everyone, and hopefully this will be the last slide.
The Philippine International Exhibition Center is planned to be the largest exhibition and convention center in Southeast Asia. As the largest gathering space for the Filipino people, its architecture seeks to be a profound expression of multiple possibilities and diverse spaces. The PIEC, with its distinctive lines and form, is a celebration of global exchange and its waterfront location. It gracefully embraces the steadfast spirit of seafaring balanghay boats that once crossed the rippling waves of the Philippine seas and brought our ancestors to these islands. The soaring 150-meter spanning central arches are an intricate showcase of design and engineering, expressing the intricate geometry of unfurled sails formed by intersecting ETF and disc forms. These sails tower over the rippling roof forms that reflect the adjacent waters of Manila Bay and sit on a terracotta base that embodies the traditional palayok, or clay pot. It captures the aspirations of the Filipino nation, both in its cultural heritage and its forward-looking aspirations. It is a living vessel that highlights the incredible possibilities of our collective future. It represents a vision of a nation that is international in its outlook and ambitions, reaching out to distant horizons and embracing a world of opportunities. It is a tribute to the Philippines' desire to engage with the global community, foster connections, and contribute to a future that knows no boundaries. The architecture becomes a living observation of intertwining dualities. It stands as a testament to the enduring legacy of the past and as a springboard to define the future of Philippine architecture.
I think that's all I have today. Sorry if I exceeded the time, and thank you.
Well, architecture should not differentiate. That's the biggest takeaway from that presentation. Thank you, Architect William, for those inspiring insights. And thank you for sharing with us how architecture can really create social, cultural, and environmental impact. Well, to our members of the audience, do not forget to post your questions in the Q&A box. At the end of both our presentations, we'll be taking questions from all of you to our audience. So do not forget to post your questions there. With that, it is now time for me to introduce you all to our next speaker. Well, joining us for his presentation is renowned for his work across infrastructure, civic, and institutional projects, including the Signature Bridge, Delhi, Agartala International Exhibition Center, and Marine Drive Promenade, Mumbai. While his designs demonstrate a masterful balance between functionality, cultural context, and public engagement. While he's the one who has consistently shown that architecture can shape communities, enhance urban experiences, and also leave a lasting impact. Well, join us here for his presentation is architect Ratan J. Batliboi from RatanJBatliboi Consultants. A very warm welcome, Mr. Ratan.
Thank you. Thank you.
Well, we are
Thanks,
glad
Priya.
to have you, and over to you.
Thank you. Let me try and share my presentation.
William, I would request you to stop sharing your presentation. That's when Mr. Ratan will be able to share his presentation.
Hmm,
Yes, Mr. Ratan, you can now share your presentation. That's when it will go live.
Lovely. Can you see, guys?
Yes, we can.
Okay. Thanks, William. That was super. Very lovely because it just showed how architects can technically change the world, if I may. I'm going to do uh, more a questioning sort of presentation because after working for almost 45 years, I still have more questions than answers. But here goes. Yeah. The context for me is we live, work, and play in Mumbai. Most of our viewers are probably tuned in from Mumbai, and that's great because there's a benefit. I'm looking at the city versus the people. And in the city, you have several issues like pollution, pressure, migration, corruption, infrastructure, organic growth. There's the formal, the informal, the natural, population densities, managing of resources. There's the whole political power structures, governance, bureaucracy, etc., etc., etc. On the people side, it's much simpler because end of the day, it's just about resilience. It's about attitude. It's the interdependence of people on each other. It's about tolerance and survival. It's about building on the past. It's about ignoring the present, but moving towards the future. Aspiration and yet discontent or achievement and then therefore contentment. Religion, faith, people who are uneducated, unexposed, and of course, the bottom line, which is the culture, customs, and traditions of our people. How do we measure impact? I think the key attributes of impact would be sociability and people, the activities and its users, access and linkages, comfort and imageability. The intangibles from all this is pretty much about diversification, stewardship, cooperative stuff. So stuff that you can't really measure. It's very difficult to say, okay, this particular thing impacted so many people, or this was the impact felt from an architectural intervention or something like that. But in principle, we have so many intangibles around this common space of placemaking that we normally talk about. And I'm looking at the third layer here, which is the metrics. How many women, children, how many social networks, what's the volunteerism, what's the traffic data, how did you transit here, what is the pedestrian activity, How does it impact property values, rent levels, retail sales, etc., etc., etc.? Going on to crime, statistics, sanitation, environmental data. Now the big five have pretty much established this and talked about cities and the impact that they make on people's lives. We're here talking about an architectural scale which is slightly different. It's about quantity versus quality. Am I very proud that we have so many projects in the system, that we've done so many waterfront developments or campuses or exhibition design or whatever? Or am I looking at really the quality? How has it impacted families, communities, children, public spaces, even the government in terms of policy? I think that's a very important scenario that we're coming from. It's about today and tomorrow. Am I designing for today in terms of what people can use, what they need, how they function? Or am I talking to the kids of tomorrow and actually making them, sensitizing them into what better quality of life they can create or achieve through whatever they do and how they treat their fellows, etc.? It's urbanization versus climate change. Am I into urbanization and that's my impact? Or am I doing stuff that's going to create stuff like this? Okay, flooding. We've all gone through 3 days of pretty much sitting at home instead of going to work because we're flooded in. It's about being driven by innovation versus being looking at regulation and creating these blocks only because they comply. It's about the local versus the local versus the global. I mean, we've been seeing influences from all over the world coming in and hitting us ever since the 1990s when liberalization happened. But are we losing something along the way? Because the social economic growth versus culture versus customs and traditions, I think it's changing the way we're looking at our communities, we're looking at life. And that makes a huge impact when you look at people on the street, because they're going into these habitats which are pretty antiseptic for them. They're out of place in certain areas, and that really impacts how they feel or the quality of life they have. Do we design for a few versus design for many? And I think this is where we pretty much started our whole social architecture story many years ago in the early 80s when we started looking at railway stations and doing public projects. This, of course, is Marine Drive, as you all know, which was a beautiful intervention. You must thank COVID for allowing me to shoot a photograph with not one soul in this frame. It's not been photoshopped. This is just the birds flying in the sky. We have impact which is planned versus organic. Okay. Do we look at impact which is planned, which is better because it's planned? Or do we look at impact because it's organic? It may be a bit of a compromise in terms of the urban spaces and stuff like that, but maybe there's big impact happening on other services, utilities, etc. I think the important thing is competition. All our projects are competition. Every architect, every urban designer is about competition. Why not collaborate? I think the collaboration is completely missing, and this is pretty much what we should be talking about and focusing upon in our lives as architects. I think the constant choices that we are expected to make is, do we break to make? Do we individually design things as per our design approach? Do we look at destroying natural habitats? Do we look at more urban development? I think William had a lot of answers because it came through beautifully, and we'll talk about that pretty much in this chat session that we have. With our collective thinking, can we plan sensitive growth and fill in the gaps in our current reality? I think that's the most important thing. I think if we apply our minds to see how we can look at sensitive growth, it may make sense for us. And just doing a quick response to 1973 to 1990, this was the Mumbai to Pune corridor. I think most of us are familiar with this. In 1990 to 2010, it sort of defined itself like this. And now it looks pretty much, this was in 2020. 5 years post that, you can barely distract or criticize where Mumbai started, stopped, where Navi Mumbai started, stopped, etc. I think this is the important thing about spatial growth and urban explosion. It just takes you by storm. You don't know what's happening. It just completely overtakes the entire environment. It overtakes everything that's happening in its path. Sensitizing change is very important, and I think collectively we are responsible for growth. Culture being the software of cities, just as the built environment is its hardware. I think this was very sensitively spoken about at one of the conferences that I attended. And I think it made huge sense to me because we realize that we're, like William said, I mean, we're the authors. We can organize, we can get people together, we can get communities together. And this is the important thing that we should look at. I think our current risk landscape, and this was very interesting because economic risk is pretty much 66%. Okay. There's AI generated misinformation, there's socio-political polarization, there's cost of living crisis, there's digital cyber attacks. I mean, which one do you attack? Which one do you look at first? Which one do you address as architecture in terms of urbanism, etc.? Our role as the architects, urbanists, planners, designers, engineers, professionals, and citizens is primarily creating an impact at a scale that we can control. If you see on my slide, we have a human scale represented on the right-hand side corner. And we're looking at impact at regional, city level, neighborhood level, building level, even livelihoods, maybe innovation and sustainability. Everything reasonably within our control and impacting at human scale. So if we look at a regional scale, we pretty much talk about new urban development, we talk about walkable cities, we talk about reverse migration. I mean, send people outside of our urban concentrations into maybe decentralizing urbanization. Make walkable cities. These are concepts that everybody's playing with. When we look at it at a city scale, we're looking at maybe conserving our heritage, maybe looking at live, work, and play environments, maybe looking at high-income housing, as well as disaster housing. I mean, we should look at it in all spaces, in all perspectives, from all the lenses that we'll talk about as we go through this presentation. When we look at it at the neighborhood scale, we talk about affordable housing versus community housing. We talk about rental versus urban squares. I mean, the neighborhoods pretty much can be impacted by the kind of business or the kind of buildings that we have in the spaces. Yeah. We've got building scales, technically looking at new technologies, local materials, biophilic design, climate responses. We're going away now from the architecture into livelihoods, because this is pretty much what we need to look at first and then design for. So the Dukan Makan, like we talked about, we look at regenerating of skills and techniques. We look at upskilling. We look at supporting workers that work with us. We look at establishing. If you notice, the figure on the right has grown substantially. And in principle, if we say that we're looking at humanization, I think this is the most important thing. At an innovation level, we look at social enterprise, we look at advanced technologies, we look at creating opportunities, we look at basically creating market spaces, creating markets where you can look at innovation, you can look at livelihoods, you can look at socio-economic benefits, etc. And most importantly is about sustainability. I mean, if we don't design for sustainability, we don't design for natural disasters or man-made disasters, we don't look at consciously looking at carbon footprints reducing, I think the important thing is to see that we have a rural development catching up with our urbanism and not have that divide between the two. I think it's a very important thing that we look at in terms of urban design and architecture. What we have here is, if we look at being able to measure, maximize, do mathematical models, motivate, monetize, mitigate, merge, manage, and maintain, okay? We have the new tools for this. And I think this is very important because a lot of the people that are listening to this conversation, a lot of people are aware in practice that we have several fantastic tools today to look at how we can impact our social architecture, how we can impact the way we look at interventions that we do for our normal lives. In principle, you're looking at new collaborations. I think that's very important. we're looking at new impact that can be created. We should also look primarily at new responsible nation building. I think for me, that's the most important message that I'd like to push across. With responsible nation building, we're talking about effectively being able to generate a sensibility and a sensitivity towards each other, towards the way we want to see India moving forward, towards the way we want to see our social impact in and through our urban architecture. If we look at all this pretty much together, it cannot be done without trust and credibility, without ethics and fair practice, and most importantly, its user benefit. If we forget this, I think we're on the wrong bus. If we look at it in principle, we're looking at appropriate urbanism, we're looking at architecture for impact, and the most important thing, like I said, was about trust, credibility, ethics, fair practice, and user benefit. Thank you. And I think this is just a world map in terms of, what we can do, how we can do, why we can do. Most of the images that we talked about are images that we have done and worked on. Those are the images of our projects. I didn't want to burden this conversation with our projects because I wanted the message to come through in terms of what we could do in terms of a collective and collaborative effort for Mumbai as well as India. Thank you very much.
Well, thank you so very much, Architect Ratan, for taking us through this journey of architecture that truly makes a difference. Well, so thank you once again. And we'd also like to thank William once again. I must say that both your presentations truly highlighted the power of architecture with purpose and social responsibility. Having said that, before we move into the audience questions, let's explore a few deeper threads into conversations. Architect Ratan, I'd like you to take the discussion ahead.
You're on mute.
So
Hi,
you're
Ratan.
on mute.
Sorry.
Yeah.
Sorry. Lovely listening to you because it was beautiful, because that's the sort of journey we took. It started with you being a big fish in a small pond, which is fabulous. And my advice to a lot of the kids who are listening in, a lot of the young architectural practices who are listening in, I think it's very important for us to get out and decentralize. If we can get out of our urban clutches and get into smaller urban settlements, that'll make much more meaningful stuff. I think one of the questions that I had, and you mentioned that we went from the barangays to the parishes to the chapels, and it's really the church and the state that went to the people. I think that's a fabulous way of looking at it. It's a sort of top-down approach or bottom-up approach. I'm not sure which one we'd say here. But I think one of the most important things that we have, and I'd like you to expand on that a bit, is we have, unfortunately, guys sitting on the top who control everything. Yeah. Now you automatically have almost a self-writing system because the barangays are the communities, the parishes and the churches, the religious structure, and the community is really talking to the church and the authority. Yeah. So how do you negotiate that is my question. Okay. And we can talk about this in terms of, what we talked about, as well as I think one of the most important lines that you mentioned in your talk was remember why we build. I think one of the most important lines that I heard. We must remember why we build.
I think like architecture, works wonderfully, especially when we're working with the local community. It's when it becomes top down that it starts to become disassociated with the end user. I think this is most especially seen in large housing complexes, right? The government tends to build housing for, let's say, 5,000 people. And, there's really not much of a feedback because the builder and maybe the planner and the designers are not beholden to who they're actually building for. And so I think a large part of this, in many ways, industrialization of architecture has made it very detached from the people. And but if you look at the church and the state, as in our case, but it's actually not the national government, but the local governments, they're very beholden because, for example, the barangay would have a few hundred people. So, the leader will, it's like a village chief. So you'll be in touch with everyone in your barangay. And this was seen when we had the pandemic, wherein, for, government help or benefit was cascaded to the people was through the barangays. Because the national government had no way to reach the people on the ground. So it was through these small community leaders that, that help was, given out. And I think in many ways, educating people, giving them the, even culture can be disseminated this way. That's what we're trying to do. We're trying to attack the problem from a bottom-up approach. How we can maybe make change happen in the local level. And yet, obviously, when we're doing massive projects, it's a national project. But how we actually approach the problem is from the other end. Maybe it becomes like sometimes it's maybe it extends the time needed or the work that needs to be put in a project. But by working it or attacking a problem from both ends, I think we're able to kind of like try to balance that a bit more. I don't know if that's kind of like something you guys do as
Yeah.
well.
No, I think it's an interesting thing because, when you work at the scale of a bookshop library or the bookstop library, and you work at the scale of the Philippines International Exhibition Center, what were your most critical challenges? And
Um,
and, and what happened to the barangay and the parish at that time? You
yeah, I
know,
think the barangay, the bookstop level, I think the challenge that we realized was that we need so like at the barangay level, you might not be able to find people who want to take care of the library because you need maybe an organization, or maybe a company, that would be responsible for the upkeep of the library, or even because the idea was to hold regular events, weekly, maybe classes or lectures, and you need someone to be in charge to be able to organize. So you need an organizer, and so that's the main challenge in the small libraries because the willingness to build them, is we've had a lot of inquiries. The problem is you cannot build them without someone taking charge of them. So there needs to be an organizing entity. I think in terms of the bigger scale, it's actually a bit easier because, so for example, we were doing the convention center, right? It's about 300,000 square meters. And so since I've been wanting to put up a library, I just inserted a 500 square meter library. No one even asked me like what that space was. I just kind of like inserted it there. So, so we're trying to insert these ad hoc space, this like, ad hoc spaces, in all these like big infrastructure projects we're doing. And I think by working both ends, we're able to do so because we're not just getting a project and executing. We're also like proposing projects the other way, like from the local to the national. So there's kind of like two ways of pushing it. Yeah.
yeah, that's lovely. Yeah.
But also,
Priya,
like, the reason I put in the convention center was because I saw, the projects in your website about the convention centers. And I
yeah,
wanted to, pick your brain about it actually and ask like, we're talking about impact and like, more community-driven architecture. But then these convention centers, by their very nature, they're a bit private, right? So they maybe cater to, singular events. So how did you manage to like balance that in that way?
so I think that's a lovely question because we were very, very sensitive to this being 17 acres of land being taken away from the public and being guarded behind closed walls. Okay. So first of all, we refused that to happen. We created a large plaza and a restaurant and things like that within the space where people would come in and use it irrespective. We created a large foreground. We mixed convention center with exhibition center, with marriage halls, with social architecture in terms of people coming in as community and using the spaces, to use it for whatever festivals and etc. We also created a space for a museum which would have a continual stream of people. Okay, and coincidentally, Sitco was turning 50 at the time, and we could have done a beautiful what we call a Sitcosium, which is the Sidco Museum, to talk about the journey of that, the City Industrial Development Corporation, and how they grew from zero to whatever they are just now, and how that whole process. But that never happened. I don't think the restaurant even works. you know. And but what is exciting? What is exciting is that they're on social media today, and they're gassing a lot, and they're getting a lot of eyeballs and people. Coincidentally, through COVID, and since you talked about this, they converted the entire space, roughly 150,000 square meters, into square feet into an entire infirmary, okay, a COVID facility center. And that was one of the most incredible social implications of that. Yeah. And then, of course, you're doing these large exhibitions for building materials and et cetera, et cetera. But we are excited to see that people are booking this exhibition space for these large religious gatherings or these large community, religious sermonizing and things like that. So that's an interesting way of looking at user-friendly stuff. Yeah. And like you say, I mean, you have probably 30 working days or 40 working days of an exhibition center in a year. And this keeps it sort of running maybe 180 days to 200 days, which is a good way of looking at it. Yeah.
Yeah. So I guess what I want, because we're just in the process of like we're building it right now. So
Yeah.
I wanted to see if I was in the right track.
Yeah,
Hey, we
absolutely.
invented a museum as well.
Absolutely. Yeah. The problem is who pays for the maintenance, that's the critical
Yeah.
issue.
Yeah.
And you have either you jack up the prices so much that only the few can sort of book the place, or you keep it reasonably accessible, in which case you can keep it running for more. I think the issue is keeping dead space alive. Most
What we
important.
try to do is we try to activate so in the entire front of the building is like 3 tiers of retail dining establishments. So at least you have an everyday people dining there because it
Yes,
has
yes.
the nice view of the sunset, right? So we wanted there to be foot traffic with or without the events. And we're inserting a like a 1 hectare botanical garden under the sales.
Beautiful. Yeah,
So I think at least we have this like indoor park, where people can actually come
yeah,
in regardless. But the museum is the one I'm kind of like, I don't know how to. So what we're trying to do is the entire loading bay is we turn it into this like we said that if there's no event, it just becomes like an outdoor like community space or like so
yeah,
we're building a huge mural there and then it can become like a gallery and stuff like that.
yeah. But the only problem with that, William, is that when there is an event, the community is locked out.
Yes, yes.
And then you suddenly realize that the community is sacrificial.
Yeah.
Yeah, you can sacrifice the community because somebody's paid it for a loading bay.
Yeah.
So you have to be very conscious of that, because the minute people start using it as their own and then being told you can't play here, you can't stand here because it's dangerous or whichever way, it
Mhm.
becomes an issue. So I think that's an important thing to keep an eye on. But I love the concept of the front decks being open to the river and the view and the botanical garden. Sounds great, man.
Thanks.
Yeah,
I
good.
think one of the things that was interesting also for me, listening to your talk was this idea about metrics.
Yeah,
And I've been pondering this the last couple of weeks because there's been a lot of flooding going on in our country. And I think a big flaw about planning and infrastructure, even the urban environment, is that the metrics are engineering driven. So
absolutely.
it's about how many kilometers of road, how many kilometers of bikes, and how many pumping stations, how like it's usually, at least in our end, it's not environmentally driven, and because they always feel like the environment is detached from the human condition. So I feel like there needs to be a stronger correlation that would allow us to say that the environment is a big part of the human condition also. I think that's
Yeah.
becoming a bit detached because the engineering kind of like gets in the way.
That's why in one of my slides I said what works for the environment will work for the people, not necessarily the other way around. What works for the people doesn't necessarily work for the environment. So I think these are, we're treading on some very thin ice here. in terms of, the economic structure of the Philippines is judged by your GDP and how you progress and how much money you make, etc., etc. Whereas Bhutan, they talk about, happy city, and that index is completely different. Okay. So do you want to be happy, or do you want to be economically wealthy? Be able to sit at the table with the big boys. That's really the question. That's our biggest, hardest question to answer. Yeah.
I think I think given like countries with, especially countries with like big populations, or even let's talk about cities maybe, that the human element is very sizable. And I wonder if there should be some way to quantify that also, because if you have 30 million people in a city, then the
Yeah.
happiness level, or the health and wellness of that population must matter. And yeah.
Yeah. Yeah. And that's where you say, even if you can impact 20% positively, that converts to millions of people. And that's a huge number. I think that's an important way of looking at it. But like you said, the metrics are governed by the big five, who say, okay, you should be judged by the performance of your road and railways and stuff like that. Yeah. Unfortunately, in our spaces, people are ignored. We forget that we're architects for designing for users, and we forget
Actually,
the user.
I was wondering if maybe the entire model of like, at least that the transportation infrastructure is largely defined by the highways, right? And I think our model is based on the American model, and it's simply not applicable because it's a car driven model.
Yeah.
And so right now we're seeing all the problems of that, because basically the guys in charge of the road are the ones in charge of the environment, and that doesn't
Yeah.
work.
Wrong people in the wrong jobs. Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, I think Priya's come on to help us to get our time organized so that we can ask a couple of questions, or get asked a couple of questions from the crowd. So go ahead, Priya.
Well,
You
absolutely.
govern.
Absolutely. Thank you. Firstly, I must say that was a delightful conversation. Thank you, Architect Ratan and Architect William. Well, as promised, we'll be taking some questions from our audience members. But before we do that, we have a quick poll for our members. So I would urge all our audience members to please participate in our poll questions. So, first poll question is for all of you, which is, what is the most important driver of impactful architecture today? We have four options for you. First being designing for community engagement. Second being sustainability and ecological responsibility. Our third option is cultural relevance and heritage preservation. And fourth being innovative use of materials and technology. So you'll have a few seconds to vote, which is that one option that you would like to go for when this question is up, which is, what is the most important driver of impactful architecture today? I would urge everyone to participate, and let's see which option gets the highest percentage.
Priya, they're not letting us answer.
Well, it's audience members here.
Actually, while we're waiting, like, one of the things that is hard to address, in the Philippines, is that when we talk about heritage preservation, and for us, it's not as much as preserving heritage as a matter of finding this culture, because we've kind of like, being a colony and colonized for so long, and we haven't had the time to actually develop our own structures. And so I think that's been one of the challenges about this preservation thing.
Well,
Yeah.
absolutely. So yes, with that, I do see that we, other audience members, has voted for these options. So our highest engagement is for option B, which is sustainability and ecological responsibility. That bears 54%. Designing for community engagement gets 20%. Our third option, which is cultural relevance and heritage preservation, gets 10%, while our last option, which is innovative use of materials and technology, gets 17%. So having said that, sustainability and ecological responsibility bears the highest percentage, which is 53%. Fair enough. With that, we have
William, what's your answer?
The first one.
First
The
one, yeah.
first
I'm
one.
saying get the community engaged. They will do everything else.
Yeah.
If the community, if you ignore the community, you can forget about everything else. That's the most important thing. At least that's my perspective, and I'm glad William has the experience to say, community, community, and community. I mean, it's just for the users. Yeah.
Absolutely. Very well said, sir. Well, with that, we'd also like to post one more question. That is a very pertinent question, that why are you joining today's session? And we'd love to know your thoughts and feedback on that. Your first option being to learn how architecture can transform communities, or is it to explore socially conscious design strategies? A third option being to get inspiration for future urban or civic projects, or have you joined to understand international best practices in architecture for impact? Well, our audience members can go ahead and vote. Let's see which option gets the maximum percentage. But we'd
You
love
should
to
do
know
a,
your thoughts, that why have you joined today's session?
you should do a before and after.
Yeah, then you see the shift.
Yeah.
Well, all right. With that, we have the highest percentage going for the first option. I think there's a diff between the first and the second option, which is to learn how architecture can transform communities, with that goes for 38%. A second option being 33% people have joined to explore socially conscious design strategies, while 8% goes to get inspiration for future urban or civic projects. Well, 21% of people have joined to understand international best practices and architecture for impact. Fantastic. The highest vote goes to learn how architecture can transform communities. Well, if that's the option that most of our audience members have joined, I must say you're at the correct place at the correct session today. So thank you to our audience members for voting and being so participative in our poll questions. Having said that, it's now time we go ahead with the questions received from our audience members. So I do see a lot of questions posted in our Q&A box. So first up, our question is for William. William, are you all set?
Yeah.
Our first question for William is that, can you give us a little more insight into the funding model for the Passaic River urban redevelopment? That question is from Samir Sheikh.
Actually, the funding model is very interesting when it began. The idea was all the big companies, all the big conglomerates, they all have a stake by the river. They have developments by the river. So they were all asked to donate about $20 million each. And so we were targeting to generate a total of about 20 of them, to reach out to 20 of them. And so we had a lot of these pledges. I think they all kind of came in. We maybe were at around, I think, 10 or 12 of them already. Yeah, so that was how it was supposed to be funded. But then it kind of like shifted in the end towards government funding it, for various reasons. So in the end, it was the national government funding it, which is a very regional project, actually. So the national government is the one funding it. Yeah.
All right. Thank you, William, for answering that question. Well, Samir also has one more question for Mr. RatanJBatliboi, that you talked about competition versus collaboration. So while collaboration is the new norm in other countries, and while collaborative model is picking up in India, why, according to you, it prevents to collaborate? Is it more cultural or systematic or financial?
I think it's ego. Every architect has to leave the ego at the door and try and figure out how they can contribute. It's also the situation of, I'm the guy, I'm the winner, I'm the leader, I'm the organizer, I'm the key alpha male. Okay. It doesn't work like that. Collaboration means humility to start with. And then you bring to the table whatever you can, in whatever scale, at whatever scale, and whatever contribution you can. I think that's the most important thing. And there are several collaborations where I'm playing a 2% role, sometimes where I'm playing a 98% role, and it doesn't matter how we split the fee or why we do what we do. I think that's an important thing. Yeah.
Well, very well said. Thank you, sir, for answering that question. Well, we have one more question from Nikhat Jafri, who's saying that I am a final year architecture student and currently working on a sustainable and inclusive group housing. why it is difficult to find a befitting case study from India representing these, in bracket is mentioned, biophilia, inclusivity, and sustainability. These are availability of short-scale group housing projects, but why not its implementation on a larger scale?
So, Nikat, I don't think there's a shortage of projects or case studies. I think it's a question of probing much, much more in terms of who are doing these things. I could list at least 10 of our projects which are looking at biophilia, inclusivity, sustainability. I think the important thing is to just reach out and get what you can. I mean, and go and talk to the guys who are actually doing this stuff. A lot of the projects don't hit the ground sometimes, but you have concepts, you have ideas, you have ideation that's happening. And I think it's important to be part of these think tanks to get yourself sort of acquainted with this. And maybe at some point you'll be the lucky guy who gets a project and all of us can help you.
Thank you, Architect. Well, with that, I'd like to bring William back into the picture. Well, we have one more question for you, that which parts of Manila inspired the Pasig River Esplenda?
It's largely inspired by the Spanish city. We have a walled Spanish city called Intramuros. So it's pretty much intact. And so yeah, so the first stage, at least the segment that we've done, is actually based on Intramuros. So yeah.
Thank you. Well, we'll take one more question, which is from Farazdak Chopadwala. This is for Architect Ratan, that what are the chances of architecture ever succeeding in its goals in a city like Mumbai, where the agenda is driven by builders and politicians? What do you have to say about that?
I think we need to get into bed with the builders and politicians if that's the case. Yeah. If you want a voice, you have to collectively sound it. There are lots of stuff that's happening. There's a whole group of architects in Bombay who are very active on WhatsApp for sure. It's about 150 odd of us who just talk about issues. But when it gets down to actually doing it, there's not one single volunteer who will pick up the ball. Yeah. Or there's the same 4 volunteers who will try and organize their lives. I think it's important to see. I mean, you cannot live in this cynical system where you say nothing is ever going to happen. I mean, we did it. We did a lot of projects. We've done a lot of public projects, civil projects, impactful projects across Bombay, across India. And it worked, right? But if you say, I didn't get paid my fees, I don't get recognized as the architect, I wasn't even called for the inauguration, I wasn't even allowed to sit in the front row, et cetera, et cetera. Those are ego issues. You can forget about all that. Yeah. If you're willing to put your act together, get your act together and contribute, you can get things going for sure. And you have to work, like William said, at a scale which is relatable, which doesn't, they're quick wins. You don't need to get into the state government or the central government to give you a small plot of land to do a small architectural intervention, which somebody might see, recognize, and duplicate. Yeah, give the plans to somebody else to do. I mean, you might make 2 bookstop libraries. Somebody else might make 75, but collectively you've made 77. Yeah, and that's the issue. That's the way it should go. And I'd love to have a long chat with you if you feel that it cannot be done.
Thank you. Very well said, sir. Well, that was the last question that we took from our audience members. With that, we'd like to thank once again Architect Ratan and Architect William for sharing such powerful insights and stories. Well, before we close, once again, a big thank you to both of you for joining us here and to our audience members as well. Thank you once again to our incredible speakers and to all of you for joining us live. Well, I must say that today's session reminds us that architecture doesn't just build spaces, it shapes communities, nurtures culture, and leaves a lasting social impact. Well, until next time, stay curious and keep designing with purpose. Thank you once again for joining us here.
Thrusters. Check. Door lock check.
डोर लॉक घर का डोर लॉक किया था या भूल गया घर का लॉक फटाफट से चेक करके आऊं क्या
ले आइए गोदरेज IoT 9 डिजिटल लॉक 9 सिक्योर एक्सेस मोड्स ऑटोमेटिक लॉकिंग ट्रिपल बोल्ट और कई एडवांस फीचर्स अब घर के अंदर या बाहर रहो बेफिक्र
घर जाते ही गोदरेज डिजिटल लॉक लगवाऊंगा।
Welcome to the Godrej Value Co-Creators Club, where innovation meets collaboration. GVCC is a unique platform for architects and interior designers to merge their creative visions with our innovative product offerings. We aim to cultivate a network of thought leaders, driving innovation and excellence in the industry. Celebrate your achievements with our GV's awards, recognizing innovative projects across various verticals. Join our community through exhibition visits and masterclasses to stay updated on the latest trends and technologies. Enjoy exclusive access to new products, special discounts, and tours of our Mumbai and Goa plants. Join the Godrej Value Co-Creators Club today. Be part of a community that values innovation, collaboration, and sustainability.